We've already learned that if a market is in equilibrium, then the quantity demanded will be equal to the quantity supplied. There'll be no excess supply or excess demand, no shortages or surpluses. Every unit of good that gets produced gets sold. Free markets, when allocating resources efficiently, will usually achieve an equilibrium in which the market clears. But what if a government decides to intervene in a market and implement what we call price controls? There are two types of price controls that we're going to talk about in this video: price ceilings and price floors. Let's start by defining a price ceiling. A price ceiling is a maximum price imposed by the government, usually set below the equilibrium price, meant to help consumers of a good. An example of a price ceiling that we're going to examine in this video is rent controls. Rent controls. Rent controls are commonly used in major cities to keep housing affordable for lower income families. They're essentially maximum rents that landlords are allowed to charge for apartments or houses in order to keep rents low to benefit renters. Before we look at the effect of price ceilings, let's go ahead and define price floors as well. A price floor is a minimum price set by the government, usually above equilibrium, in order to help producers of a good. Notice the important key terms in these definitions. In order to be considered effective, a price ceiling must be set below the equilibrium price. Now, this can be confusing because you might think of a ceiling as existing above something. But in the case of a supply and demand diagram, for a price ceiling to have any effect on the market, it must be set below. On the other hand, a price floor must be set above equilibrium price in order to have any effect. We'll look today also at price ceilings and price floors that are non-binding or ineffective. As an example of a price floor, we're not going to look at a market for a good, rather we're going to look at the market for a resource. And the resource we'll look at is labor. Nearly every state in the United States and many countries have what we call minimum wages. A minimum wage is essentially a price floor in the market for labor. A minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage rate in a market in order to help not producers, but in this case households who are supplying their labor to the labor market. Let's begin our analysis in the market for apartments in a city. We're going to look at the rent. In fact, the price of an apartment, the price of land in general, is called rent. Let's start by drawing the equilibrium in this market, where supply of housing or apartments equals the demand of housing or apartments. Of course, in a free market without any government intervention, the quantity of housing available, QE, and the price of housing, or the rent, we'll call this PE, keeping in mind that this is actually the rent, is determined by the supply of housing and the demand for housing. But what happens if a government decides to intervene in the market for housing and make housing more affordable for people by putting a maximum price or a price ceiling in the market? Now let's go back to our definition. A price ceiling has to be set below the equilibrium price in order to help consumers. So let's establish a maximum price. We'll call this PM, the maximum price, somewhere below PE. What impact is this price ceiling going to have on the market for housing in this city imposing these rent controls? Well, to determine that, we can go over and find out what the quantity supplied and what the quantity demanded for housing will be at the new price of PM, the maximum price imposed by the government. Now, here's what we see. The lower rent is going to create an incentive for more people to move into this city and demand a greater quantity of housing. We move along the demand curve as the rent for housing falls, causing an increase in the quantity demanded. On the other hand, landlords, those who are responsible for providing housing, have less of an incentive to provide residential real estate. Instead of using their buildings, their properties for apartments and for housing, they might convert them to retail properties or commercial properties. They may tear them down altogether and sell the land to developers. Either way, the quantity supplied of affordable housing is actually going to decrease as a result of this maximum price imposed by the government. So we end up with the situation in which, and we've seen this before, the quantity demanded for the good exceeds the quantity supplied. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. The term we use for this situation is called a shortage. Some consumers are better off, but only those who are able to get their hands on the cheaper apartments. So the quantity supplied has decreased. Those who are able to find housing at the price of PM, at the now lower rent, are going to be better off. There will be more what we call consumer surplus for those who are able to find housing. However, due to the disequilibrium in this market, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, so the effect on consumer surplus or welfare of consumers is as follows. Consumer surplus will be the white area in my graph, and producers are unambiguously worse off because of these rent controls, because of this price ceiling in the market for housing. Producers experience a decrease in welfare as a result of the lower rent and the lower quantity that they are able to supply to the housing market. And what is the net effect on welfare overall? Well, there's going to be a loss of total welfare represented by the purple area. This purple area represents the deadweight loss, or the amount by which society as a whole is worse off because of the maximum rental rates imposed by the government. Some consumers are better off. All producers, or all landlords in this case, are worse off, but society as a whole is worse off by the purple shaded area. Price ceilings intended to help consumers do indeed help some consumers, but only those who are able to find the now price-controlled good at the lower price. Because the shortages have created a situation in which there is less quantity available than there is demanded, there will be plenty of consumers who are worse off. So these people are now without homes. We have a word for that. Homeless. All right, now that doesn't necessarily mean they're living on the streets. It means they can't afford an apartment or a home at the rent-controlled price. Therefore, they may have to leave the city, they may have to pay some rental rate above that price, and perhaps even turn to the black market to find homes that otherwise might have been rented out at the maximum price imposed by the government.